Hello, everyone. This is Matt Whitbread, and this is my presentation on my final project here for measuring business cycles. So really the purpose of this, the project that I tried to work on here was this notion of trying to forecast industrial production with enough lead time to get a steer in terms of potentially being able to forecast equities. So what this chart shows here is essentially industrial production year-over-year changes versus year-over-year changes in equities based upon the Wilshire 5000 index. So equities are in blue, industrial production is in orange. And really the main takeaway here is to show the fact that a couple of things. One, there's a strong relationship between the two in terms of cyclical swings. So year-over-year changes in industrial production tend to follow suit with equities. The other big part is the fact that equities tend to lead the swings within industrial production. In other words, equity markets do a pretty effective job of discounting where industrial production or general economic output is going to go in the future. So the purpose of this is to try to say, do we have the ability to forecast industrial production with enough of a lead time that essentially gives us a bit of a cushion before equity markets are essentially pricing it in? So that was the general scope of what I was looking to do within this. So we show here a cross correlation here between equity markets and industrial production. Again, year-over-year changes. We can see that essentially the equity markets lead industrial production of about 6 to 7 months. So that's essentially the time frame they're working on here. We're trying to essentially get something that's something more akin to maybe 9 to 10 months ahead of industrial production changes, so we can have a couple months of cushion to try to maybe get a steer on how we could opportunistically exploit what's happening in the equity market. So really the study follows this notion of underlying demand cycles. So we identify 5 here. There's probably others that I hadn't looked at, but from the research I looked at, these are the general, what I consider to be demand cycles that underpin industrial production. So the housing cycle, automobile, corporate structures, business capital expenditure cycle, and then the inventory cycle, all of which is probably pretty self-explanatory, with the exception maybe that CapEx is really just kind of business spending on equipment, durable goods, computers, and so forth. So what we're showing here is a kind of a stylized recession indicator, really. So I followed almost a technical recession indicator approach. So this looks at industrial production, and what I did is the methodology I used was a rolling. If you had 3 quarters of rolling negative returns, or I shouldn't say returns, but changes in industrial production, that indicates the beginning of a recession, and then vice versa for the end of a recession. So akin to a technical recession, except I made it a little bit more lengthy, and because we're dealing with monthly, I could roll it quarter by quarter basis. But that's the framework that I'm looking at. You can see here, going back to 1919, that broadly speaking, it follows the down swings and upswings in industrial production. Same framework I apply here to the housing market, just illustrating the fact that you can see that the recession indicators tend to hit the big swings. They have a couple misses and small swings, for example, within the mid 90s and then 2018. But broadly speaking, it hits the major moves you see within the housing market, and this is housing starts that we're looking at here. So for the rest of these cycles, and I don't show them all within this, I just want to show a framework in terms of how it looks. So this is housing again. So in orange, you see that housing recession indicator, and then in gray is the industrial production recession indicator. Broadly speaking, you can see that essentially ahead of almost every industrial production recession, you can see housing recession. So it's not really shocking news to most that are familiar with the housing market dynamics, but it is important to show the fact that the housing market is very much a leading indicator or leading factor in terms of industrial production. I show this here versus business spending as well, or CapEx spending, and again, you see generally the same framework, although this is a much shorter time period. The data didn't go back really past 1992 on a monthly basis, so it was kind of limited. So you can see that's a slightly smaller time frame, but broadly speaking, with the exception around 2008, you get essentially the same relationship, i.e. it leads before industrial production. So then this takes us to this housing excess supply. So this is the framework that I essentially created to try to figure out exactly how to exploit these underlying demand cycles. So it's this notion to say that typically within a cycle you have excess supply, and then, or let's take in the context of housing, a period of overbuilding, and then a period of underbuilding. So it was tricky because I wasn't able to get a lot of the data in terms of where the capital stock actually sits. So I kind of had to infer this in terms of kind of what I would consider to be a base economic variable. So what I did here was I looked at 36-month moving averages of permits, housing permits, and then the same for income, for personal income, household. So again, so two moving averages essentially, and I basically, I should say, on a year-over-year basis in terms of the growth rate. So really, what I'm looking to do within this is isolate when the growth rate of housing starts or permits is outstripping the growth rate of income, in order to try to understand exactly when there's a supply or an oversupply is building within the market. So when the housing market is being built and income is in a certain rate that income is not keeping up with, that likely is an indicator in terms of there's an oversupply and a likely correction beginning to come. So that was the general framework that I applied across all the demand cycles. It was relatively simplistic, and I went back and forth in a number of different ways, and ultimately settled on this relatively smooth trend analysis in terms of understanding essentially where there might be imbalances within some of these underlying demand cycles. So what we're showing within here is this notion of excess housing supply and how it coincides with permits. And so the supply was in blue and then the permits is in orange. And what's interesting about this is you can see from a turning point perspective, this notion of excess supply leads the turning points in housing permits. So this is very much what we were looking to try to accomplish, try to figure out how we can get some sort of a lead indicator on the underlying demand cycle and then ultimately build a leading indicator off of this. So I use housing here as an example of one way that we did it. This is another example of vehicles. So this is cars. Again, this goes back only to 1978. But again, you can see the fact that when the overall growth rate in vehicle purchases is outstripping the growth rate of income, there tends to be a correction, and then vice versa. When there's an undersupply, you tend to see that supply start to come back on the market. Business spending, this is slightly different. I didn't use income here. I used corporate profits, but very much in the same framework. So again, you can see that the cycle is a little bit smoother. Again, it only goes back to 1994, but you can see the tops, i.e. the turning points, tend to very much lead the business spending turning points. And then lastly is the inventory. Again, same framework. Yeah, keep in mind that these are different scales, but we don't really care so much about the scales. We just care much about the turning points in terms of the timing of this. So all this coincides to put into a leading indicator. So I wasn't able to necessarily follow the exact framework that we covered in class with the conference board work, but I tried to keep it as close as possible. The issue that I faced was the fact that I'm dealing with growth rates. And when you get into growth rates that swing around the zero mark, in other words, they go from 1 to -1, the math starts to get a little funky. And that denominator, if it gets close to zero, ends up with a very, very large um, incorrect growth rates, essentially, is what it comes down to. So essentially what I did was I scaled them similar to how we do in the class based upon standard deviation. So they had very much the same contribution across. And then what it is, I averaged them. The reason that I averaged them was because I wanted this to date back as far as I could. And then some of those other cycles I started, like, for example, in the 90s, and I wanted the index to be able to go as far back. So without that data, if two, I think I had housing and inventory were the first two. If those were just being used, it was an average of those two. And as the data came in to the leading indicator, it would take that data and then average it across 3 and then 4 data points. So that's essentially the methodology that I follow with this. So what I'm showing here within this graph, in blue is the leading indicator that I constructed. And then orange, I'm looking at 6-month rolling forward changes to industrial production. So the way to think about this is if on January 1st, the leading indicator is saying X, what we're comparing that to is what happens to the industrial production 6 months after that. So from January then to July. So again, we're very much trying to understand whether or not this looks forward, does an accurate job of looking forward and predicting where industrial production is going to go. So it's admittedly a bit of a messy chart, but the main takeaway, what we're looking for is whether or not that leading indicator, the trend within leading indicator, is essentially getting the trend right on the forward changes in industrial production. And that is the case. You see turning points are actually very close to where they should be. Granted, there's a little bit of latency on the trough in 2009, but nevertheless, it captures the 2008 and many of these peaks. That's capturing that very good. And we want this to be lined up. We want this to match up. We don't want this to lead, although it would be good if it did. But either way, it's if it matches up, it indicates that it is in fact leading by 6 months. So I did a number of different lead and lags with this, and 6 month ended up to be pretty much the sweet spot in terms of the highest correlations. So it effectively leads industrial production, which is good news. The bad news is when we compare this to equities, the relationship kind of falls apart a little bit. In particular, we see that equities tend to lead this leading indicator. As a matter of fact, this is probably more akin to what we consider to be a bit of a coincident indicator at this point. Not surprisingly, based upon the conference board work and the things we studied in class, equities is a leading indicator of economic output, which industrial production is a coincident indicator of. So we know the fact that equities do in fact lead this. So what we're seeing here is kind of very much that same concept. The issue is unfortunately that the model that I built wasn't able to lead it enough, it being industrial production enough to actually exploit any changes within equities. So a little bit disappointing, but I think there's other work to theoretically do within this. So, really the main conclusions and takeaways from this whole study is the fact that this notion of excess supply actually is probably worth exploring a little bit more, but it does a good job in terms of forecasting industrial production. It just doesn't do it with enough lead in order to get at equity markets. So there's a whole boatload of different things that I could follow up with this. There's all sorts of Bayesian probability models that could be utilized within this. But I think broadly speaking, the best way to go about enhancing this type of study would be to put together more comprehensive demand functions behind those underlying demand cycles that I identified. And then in addition to that, getting a better fix in terms of really what the supply or the capital stock measures look like within the economy. I kind of had to base it on growth rates, but I think if I had more access to data, was able to look to see exactly how many houses are in the markets and where and so forth, you get a better indication of really where supply lies and to try to really better exploit some of those imbalances and so forth. So that's it. That's broadly speaking my conclusion. So it was an interesting study. I think there's more work to be done on it, but I ran out of time for this class, so I'm submitting it as is. So that's it. I hope this was of interest, and thanks for listening.